Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Sak Nigam from Baker Hughes. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you here this morning at GITEX in the Power Play Energy Breakout. At Baker Hughes, we believe our job is to deliver energy in a more reliable, more efficient, safer, and cleaner way to the world. And I think from looking at the agenda today, the speakers that we've got lined up, and the panelists, you will not be disappointed. We live in a time of change with macro trends impacting our sector across full stream energy, oil and gas, power and utilities, chemicals and natural resources, nuclear, and all of the associated industries, the supply chain, the ecosystems, and technology with digital and AI playing an increasingly important role here, driving increasing opportunities, but with those opportunities come significant challenges. I'm sure you'll enjoy the debates today, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome on stage Robin Mills. Robin Mills, a renowned industry commentator. If you haven't heard from Robin before, you're in for an absolute treat. Not the author of one, but 2 books. And I'd like to welcome Robin. He'll share a little bit more. Some of the books, Myth of Oil and Gas was the first, and the second was Capturing Carbon. He's looking forward to speaking with you today, and I look forward to connecting with you throughout the day. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Sak, for the tremendous introduction, and thanks to you for being here today. I'd like to talk about the energy transformation in the Middle East. This is a time of great change in the region. It's a time of great change in energy in this region, and it's a time of great change in the energy business globally. And we here in this region are not immune from that. We're affected by these great changes, but we're also helping to shape them. And this, I'll explain why this region is so important for the future of energy, not just here, but also globally. So the energy transformation is about major advances and changes in technology, and these also bring with them changes in business models and in the kind of key players that we have. And when we think about these changes in technology, of course we think about things like the advance of renewable energy, we think about electric vehicles and so on. All of those are important, but some of the most major and transformational changes that we've had in recent years have actually been in oil and gas. And we've seen the expansion of US shale oil production, which has completely overturned the normal pattern of the oil and gas industry globally. The US, from being the world's biggest importer of oil, has now become the world's biggest producer and also a leading exporter of oil. In the power sector, of course, we've seen the rise of solar and wind. We've seen the adoption of things like advanced batteries, which are just starting to come into their own. We've seen research into advanced nuclear power, smart grids for distributing energy more effectively. In industry, the industry faces the challenge, as all parts of the economy do, of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And we're just on the start of the journey for heavy industry about cutting greenhouse gases. And there are other exciting technologies, automation, 3D printing, which are not directly connected to energy, but which have important implications for materials use and energy use. And then finally, in transport, and I referred to electric vehicles, and electric vehicles are only a small part of the fleet today, but a fast-growing one, and one with a lot of rapid advances. And it's not just about the electric cars, about the Teslas and so on, but it's also can be about electrifying transport more generally. So globally, we're seeing a shift in energy demand, and this is the continuation of a shift that's been going on for a long time, but it's having greater and greater implications as it proceeds. And it's really a shift of energy demand in the world from the industrialized to higher income countries to the emerging economies. And so over the next 20 or so years, up to 2040, we'll see energy demand in the established economies falling, so in the US, particularly in Europe, also Japan, and that's due to greater energy efficiency, more efficient technologies, and due to relatively slow economic growth and aging populations, changing demographics. And meanwhile, energy demand is then shifting to the emerging Asian economies. China, of course, very important, as it has been for the past 15 years or so in energy, but India even overtaking China as a center of energy demand growth. The Middle East is very important as well, a lot of growth also in the Middle East. And then Africa, I think, particularly will emerge, particularly towards 2040. Africa perhaps will even take over from India and China as the real motor of energy demand growth with young populations and growing economies. And the Middle East is experiencing this transition as well. And there are a number of different trends going on that are intersecting within the Middle East. There's the change in geopolitics, and we can refer to several angles in this region. Obviously, we know at the moment there are serious geopolitical challenges in the region, various conflicts in countries and also between countries. The geography of oil production is shifting, so the Middle East remains the center of global oil production, but the US has become a very important and a very critical player as well, while some established producers like Venezuela have fallen away. And even more than that, the target oil markets are shifting, so no longer is Middle East oil primarily going to Europe and North America. It is going to Asia, and as I said, China we know about. I mean, that's been known for the past 10 or 15 years, but also oil, that direction of oil shipments is shifting towards India and towards some of the, I guess we call them smaller Asian countries, but of course they're still huge countries with populations of 100 million plus if we think about the Philippines or Vietnam, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and so on. There's a new age of gas. So gas has emerged as the fastest growing fossil fuel. It's a relatively clean fuel and a key part of strategies for most countries in this region and for most of the major oil and gas companies. This region is starting to look at carbon capture and storage as a way of reducing its emissions. That's a big thing in Abu Dhabi at the moment. There are other countries starting to look at it. And nuclear power is just about to be introduced in the UAE, possibly in some other countries in the region as well, as a large and low carbon energy source. And perhaps most visibly, the transition in this region is about the rise of renewables, and particularly solar power. Wind to an extent, but really about solar power, and we've seen a number of world record-breaking projects, world record low costs and world record sizes in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, in Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region. And at the same time, efficiency is improving and subsidies, the old days of cheap energy in this region are being reformed. We're still at the early stages of improving efficiency in this region. Energy use per person remains very high, but there is attention to improving it. And now oil prices, as I talk about geopolitics, the rise of US oil production has meant that geopolitics has less of an effect on oil prices than it used to. If we go back to 2011, we had the Libyan revolution. Shortly after that, we had very intense US sanctions on Iran. Iranian oil exports were cut, and oil prices were at $100 or $110 a barrel through 2011 up to 2014. In late 2014, prices fell and have not really recovered since. And that's despite other major upsets. So again, there have been tight sanctions on Iran, there's been economic collapse in Venezuela, and of course, most recently, the drone and missile attacks on oil production in Saudi Arabia. So those attacks took out, briefly, half of Saudi oil production. Go back a few years, that would have certainly sent oil prices over $100 per barrel. Now the market has almost entirely ignored the impact of those attacks, and the oil price is actually $3 lower than it was before, which I think someone even 5 years ago would have found just incomprehensible. And as I said, the oil supply geography is shifting. The routes, the traditional routes from the Middle East into Europe and North America, and from West Africa, countries like Nigeria, into Europe and North America, have diminished, while the key routes that have grown have been, of course, the Middle East more and more to Asia, from Russia into China particularly. West Africa has lost the North American market. It's had to shift to supplying Asia. And North America, as I said, has emerged as one of the world's largest exporters of oil from being a major importer. And North America is now supplying Europe in particular, but Asia as well. I talked a bit about the new age of gas. Now, gas, the cleanest fossil fuel, it produces half of the carbon dioxide emissions of oil or coal. It doesn't produces very low levels of other pollutants. It's cheap, it's abundant, it's accessible. But what is the future for gas? Gas is still a fossil fuel. It still produces carbon dioxide when it's burnt. And there's still a lot of environmentalist opposition to gas, particularly in Europe and North America. So gas, as I see it, has three possible futures. It could be a dead end. Perhaps we will just go straight to renewables and gas will never really advance from where it is today. Gas is about a quarter of the world energy mix at the moment. Maybe it will never get much beyond that. Gas might be a bridge fuel, something that we adopt in the medium term, but by 2040 we're shifting over to renewables or other low carbon forms of energy. And this is kind of, I guess, the consensus view of gas at the moment. Or is gas a destination fuel? Is gas a major part of the world energy mix for the long term and something that we're using indefinitely? It could be. If we can continue producing gas cheaply and transporting around the world, and if we can use it more cleanly with carbon capture and storage to prevent carbon dioxide emissions from gas going into the atmosphere. And given the enormous resources in the Middle East, this is really a key question, I think, for Middle East countries. Can they actually make use of those gas resources? Can they ensure that gas is an acceptable and a clean fuel? I've talked quite a bit about carbon capture and storage because for me, this region as an oil and gas exporting region needs to make carbon capture and storage happen in order to be able to use its hydrocarbon resources and still avoid the worst of climate change. So carbon capture and storage is really about taking the carbon dioxide that's emitted when we burn oil or gas or coal and either putting it into a useful product, turning it into plastics, turning it into cement, something else useful that will trap the carbon dioxide forever, or putting it back into the ground. And we can actually use carbon dioxide to release more oil from underground reservoirs. And so we're getting a positive economic benefit and a positive environmental benefit from using carbon dioxide. So this is a key technology. It's quite widely used now in the US. I mentioned a very large project in Abu Dhabi, and there are other projects worldwide. It has not made the progress that it really needs to do yet, and it needs more support from governments and more policy support to make it a reality. And I think many governments have to accept that clean power is going to be more expensive than dirty power. Clean industries are going to be more expensive than dirty industries, and that's the price we have to pay for a sustainable environment. I mentioned nuclear power in the region. Nuclear power, I think, has had a tough few years worldwide. It's struggled to cope with cheap natural gas and with cheap renewable energy. Nuclear projects have taken a long time to come to fruition. They've been expensive. But yet nuclear power has emerged in this region as a significant energy source. And we'll see probably in 2021 the UAE starting to turn on its nuclear reactors. 5.6 gigawatts of reactors, a very significant project. And in the future, Saudi Arabia, perhaps Egypt, maybe even other countries in the region may also join the nuclear industry here. And this is a large, low-carbon energy source. It's not the cheapest, but it can be a complement to other low-carbon forms of generation. And there are, of course, interesting ideas which you may hear about today, for small modular reactors, which would be quicker and cheaper and more flexible, potentially for nuclear power, for water desalination and other uses. I guess solar power and renewable energy is getting the most headlines in the region at the moment, though. And we've really reached the point of takeoff in renewables in this region. For a long time, renewable energy has been really an afterthought. It has been contributing less than 1% of the power we generate in the Middle East. But in recent years, we've seen renewable energy, particularly solar power, we've seen it double in 2016, double in 2017, double in 2018, probably doubling this year, maybe next year again. So a remarkable record of growth in the past few years, albeit from a very low starting level. And we're seeing some of the leading countries in the region, the UAE, particularly in solar power, both Dubai and Abu Dhabi, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia now just starting to get involved as well, Oman. So more and more countries are realizing the advantages of renewable energy as a cheap, quick, and low-carbon form of energy. And this is, I think, a way in which the Middle East is driving the energy transition. So the Middle East is benefiting from all of the investment and interest in renewable energy worldwide that has reduced costs. So the investments that were made previously by Germany, for example, in reducing solar power costs, and then picked up by the Chinese in solar power and wind. But the region has moved on to actually leading the energy transition by setting world record prices. And we've seen several consistently world record low prices set in Dubai and then Abu Dhabi and then in Saudi Arabia and I expect we'll see more in the next year or so. When we started working on renewable energy in this region back in 2012, we wrote a report saying that solar power had reached the point of being competitive with oil in this region. And we said solar power in this region could be produced at 12 US cents per kilowatt hour. At that point, that was competitive with oil. When Dubai went for its first major solar bid in 2014, it halved that. It got less than 6 cents a kilowatt hour. The next bid it got was under 3 cents, so it had halved it again. And then more recently, we've seen projects in the low 2 cents, and I expect this year we will see some projects awarded at less than 2 cents a kilowatt hour, which is as cheap as anything in the world. That's a remarkable record of progress. Now, there's a lot more to be done to support the introduction of renewable energy in the region. I mentioned advanced batteries and smart grids, which can help balance the variability of solar power in the region. But this region, of course, is uniquely sunny, and it's also an ideal place for solar, where the generation from solar power coincides with summer, peak need for air conditioning. So there's really a unique match for solar power here that you don't get, for instance, in Northwest Europe. However, the energy transition is not only about renewable energy or carbon. Those are, of course, major parts of it. But it's also about globalization of energy, about the globalization of the natural gas business. It's about the introduction of unconventional oil and gas. I mentioned how important shale oil has been in the US, but we're now seeing interest in shale oil and gas in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, in other countries in the region. So it's about making the most of their hydrocarbon resources. And there is increasing attention on maximizing value from oil and gas, not just exporting crude oil, as was the case in the past, but generating additional value by turning crude oil into petrochemicals and even converting crude oil directly to chemicals without going through an oil refinery, and about extending the reach and the markets of Middle East oil and gas by investing in joint ventures in refineries, petrochemical projects in India, in China, in Japan and South Korea, and in other Asian countries, other fast-growing markets. Now, visions of future energy, I think, are subject to change. There is a view probably in Europe and North America now, and amongst environmentalists, that the future is very clear. We're going to move away from oil and gas. We're going to go into renewables by 2050. Perhaps there's a hope for many countries to be 100% run on renewables. And that's an interesting vision. Maybe things will turn out that way. Maybe they won't. If we go back to the 70s and the 80s, some countries were entirely focused on nuclear power, like France. Some countries like Germany were entirely focused on coal and were trying to get away from expensive oil and gas to focus on coal, the dirtiest fossil fuel. So views can change, and there's clearly room in the mix for technological advances, not just in renewables, but in highly efficient homes, highly efficient industries, highly efficient vehicles. I look at electric vehicles. We think about the Teslas and so on. Cars are part of it, but also electric trucks, electric shipping even with advanced batteries, even electric short-range aviation is a realistic prospect for the 2040 or 2050 timescale. And then there is the role of fossil fuels, and I mentioned carbon capture and storage. At some point, we're going to have to draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to reduce CO2 emissions, to limit climate change. And what we've learned from the oil and gas industry is how to do that, and that's something that can be applied more generally. There's a focus on gas, of course, and as I say, gas, it may be a bridge fuel, it may be something that gets us through the next 20 years. It may also be a destination fuel. It may be a key part of the world energy mix for the long term. And for countries with large gas resources, this is about making the most of those. Now, Middle East countries are facing this transition, and in some ways driving it, but they also have to react to developments worldwide. And they're adapting at varying paces and ways to a future potentially of lower oil and gas prices, which we're very much in. We have been since 2014. And also longer term potentially to a future of lower oil demand overall. Gas demand has a good chance of continuing to rise, but there are realistic ideas that oil demand by the 2030s, 2040s may be falling because of electric vehicles. So how do major oil producers adapt to that? How do they win market share? How do they retool their economies to run effectively with lower oil prices? So diversifying the economy, of course, is a key part of that. Diversifying the government sources of revenues, diversifying exports, going into other technologies, but also still making use of their competitive advantages in energy, in oil and gas, in renewable energy, solar power, and so on, and other forms of energy. The future of outlook for the Middle East oil and gas exporters is still positive. They are still, energy-wise, in a far better position than most countries. Most, but not all of them, are still in a relatively strong economic and fiscal position, particularly in the Gulf. But there are serious challenges, and all governments in the region have to be very open to these challenges, very aware of them. If we think about a target of 2030 in the energy world is basically tomorrow, when you think about the time it takes to launch a major new oil and gas project or a large new power plant or other kind of projects. So really, although 2030 seems like a distant vision, it's not. It's extremely soon. And some countries in the region, I think, are very well prepared for this transition, have thought about it seriously. Some others are struggling with internal political problems, insecurity and so on, that is making it difficult for them to take these hard, long-term decisions. And so it's quite a mixed picture for some regional countries which have not yet got on this bandwagon of the new energy transition. So in conclusion, I think it's an extremely exciting, interesting future. It's the fastest changing and the most dynamic and radical that I've known in my 20 plus years in the industry. It's also in some ways a frightening one for the incumbents who have to change their business models and adapt. But there are plenty of opportunities and a lot of smart ideas about them, and I hope we'll hear more about some of those today. So thank you very much for your time.